This is day one of the experiment to get 1 million subscribers in 1 year. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of evaluating yourself and having high self-esteem because of the power of God that exists within you. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. As we stated earlier, we are embracing a very intriguing experiment. We are trying to grow this channel from 113 subscribers to 1 million subscribers in just 1 year. And we want you to join in on the journey. So please make sure you like, you share, you subscribe, and you hit the notification bell to help the algorithm to see if Christian content creators can actually build a community of 1 million subscribers in just 1 year. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of seeing yourself the way God sees you. And this is so critical, and it's a very timely study for us to embark on because we are seeing within this current generation and in the generation that will follow after us, this sort of disappointment, this sort of low self-esteem. And what we're going to talk about today is how low self-esteem actually impacts our ability to do the things that God has called us to do. When we don't have an appropriate valuation of ourselves or value of ourselves, we tend to not do the things that God has called us to do. And furthermore, when we don't see ourselves as God sees us, it takes away our opportunity to actually do the thing that God has put us on this earth to do. So today we're going to look at a particular figure in Scripture who had critical self-esteem issues. In fact, he did not see himself as being worthy of anything. And I know it may seem very pious to say I'm nothing, right? Or I am not worth anything, but that's just not the biblical way to see yourself. God has created us all to be image bearers. He's created us, in fact, in his image, and he wants us to go throughout the world with pride, not from our own ability or our own nature, but rather from the sense that we belong to the Creator and we are working on behalf of our Creator. It's kind of like if you had a job that you worked very hard to get. It was a reputable company. It's a place that you are proud of. You're proud to represent it. You're proud of the mission statement and the vision statement and the things that this company is doing in the public. You would wear your shirts to notify individuals that you are representing this company. In fact, I just came back from dinner with an individual who had on their shirt the company that they work for because they're proud of that facility. They are proud to represent that company, and they want that company to be proud that they are representatives of that particular institution. The same way is with God. God wants us to walk around with a sense of pride, not again because we are thinking too highly of ourselves, but rather because we are proud of the God we represent. So essentially, low self-esteem is a tremendous stumbling block for Christians. It is something that gets in the way of Christians' productivity, and it causes all sorts of feuds and conflicts that wouldn't exist if we saw ourselves the way God sees us. So for our consideration, we're going to talk about Moses. Moses was an individual who had terrible self-esteem issues. And what we find in Moses' case is because of his low self-esteem issues, he was not able to be resilient at times, and he was not able to resist attacks and misfortunes. This is what low self-esteem does. It makes us feel like we cannot push forward and we cannot stand up. And anytime you feel that way, you're going to allow the enemy to beat you all across the world because you don't have that fortitude. You don't have that conviction that you can actually do something that is powerful and meaningful. The question we want to focus on today is how do we find the ability to take courage in ourselves? And we're going to start by understanding that if we want to have the proper courage to do the things that God has called us to do, we must have confidence in God. Courage in oneself begins with confidence in God. When a person has confidence in God, then a person can develop the courage within themselves to do the things that God has called them to do. So let's look at 5 excuses that are typical to individuals that struggle with their ability to live in their God-given purpose. And we're going to pull these 5 excuses from the life of Moses. Now, we all know that Moses was one of the greatest leaders in the entire world. He was definitely one of the greatest leaders in the history of the nation of Israel. He did things that no one else had done except Jesus Christ. I mean, he was the guy. But individuals who have high capacity and have an ability to do great things typically have struggles within themselves seeing their worth. Sometimes they wrestle with the fact that they actually have what it takes. And today what we want to do is we want to address these 5 excuses that are so typical among even the most confident individuals. And we want to find a biblical way to avoid and to defeat what the enemy uses to keep us away from doing things that are impactful and meaningful. So the first excuse that you might find is the excuse that I'm just a nobody. Perhaps you've said it to yourself. Perhaps you've said in your life or at some point in your life, you know, I'm just a nobody. I'm nobody. Why would I be able to do something like that? This is what Moses said in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. When God came to him in that burning bush and revealed to him what his plans were for him and how he would use him to deliver the people of Israel, his response was, "Who am I to appear before Pharaoh?" Now look at the question. Who am I to appear before someone like Pharaoh? We're talking about the king of the known world. We're talking about the ruler, the guy that has the authority to throw me out and throw me over. Who am I to go to a guy like that? Maybe you think of yourself that way. You think of yourself as being a nobody. You look at the people around you and you have this terrible habit of comparing yourself to other people based on what you perceive to be a status or a symbol of excellence. And what we're going to see here is that God does not look at us that way. In fact, when God saw that Moses had said, "Who am I? Who am I to lead the people of Israel?" His response was, "I will be with you." So whenever we say things like, "Who am I?" God's response in that circumstance is, "I will be with you." Now, that's an important detail to remember, because in verse 12, he says, "I will be with you, and I'm going to give you a sign that I am the one that has called you and sent you." Whenever you look up and you're able to see that these people that you're leading are worshiping at this very mountain. I'm going to bring you right back to this very point, and I'm going to allow you to see and recall this day when you were here doubting yourself. You're going to be able to see that I am the one that actually called you. Now, this is important because there are 2 things that helps us establish our worth. The first thing is we are worthy and we are valuable, not because of who we are, but because of who's with us. We are valuable because we are with the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the creator of heaven and earth. And in fact, he is with us. So anytime you want to walk around and say you're a nobody, you need to remember who's walking with you. You know, I can't be just a nobody because who's with me is everything. He is the creator of heaven and earth. He's the sustainer of all things. So we can't just be nobodies. But more importantly, because God is with us, we now have a purpose. And that purpose is to attract as many people to the worship of God as possible. You see, when we wake up in the morning, when I wake up in the morning, I had to really wrestle with this, because I had low self-esteem for years. I would not see my value. I would not see my purpose. I didn't have any idea of these things. But when I realized that God is with me, and when I realized that God has called me to bring others into the worship of him, you see, now I have something to live for. I have something more valuable than the car that I drive and the clothes I wear or the home that I live in or the fame or the popularity that I can create for myself. I now have a purpose that is bigger than me. And that purpose gives me a sense of worth because it is connected to the will and the purposes of God. So since we're in a generation that is struggling to see their worth, we have to avoid the trap of trying to be other people because we are dissatisfied within our own selves. So how do we get away from that? We get away from that by understanding that our worth does not come from anything that is internal or of our own doing, but it comes from who is with us, that is God, and the purpose that he's put on our lives as human beings. And that purpose is to bring others into the worship of God. Now, the second thing that Moses used as an excuse was, I don't feel close to God. You see, when you are away from God and you don't have that feeling of closeness with God, it naturally causes you to have a low value of yourself. The reason for that is we have a natural instinct to see our value when we look more like the one in whom we were created in the image of. So if you don't know the image that you are bearing, then you tend to look at yourself in a way that is of less value than what you really should see. And one of the things that we tend to do in that situation is because we don't have the closeness to God that we think we should have, we begin to borrow from the relationship that we see others have with God. So take, for instance, as Moses is sitting here hearing all of this from God, God is saying to him, listen, I'm going to use you. I'm going to fulfill my purpose through you. And Moses looks at God and says, now, if I go to the people, this is in verse 13 of Exodus chapter 3, and tell them that the God of our ancestors have sent me, they're going to ask me, what is his name? And I don't even know what to tell them. You see, what he's saying here is, I've heard about the experiences Abraham has had with you. I've heard about the experiences that Isaac and Jacob have had with you. I have heard about the stories of Joseph. But where's my experience? I don't feel as close with you, God, because I don't even know your name. I need something that will help me realize that I have an intimate relationship with you. And many people will not admit this, but here's the truth, brothers and sisters. If we don't feel close to God, we see ourselves of less value. So what does God say to him? God doesn't say, well, it's okay. I'm going to show up and I'll prove to them that I'm with you. But what God does here is in verse 14, he tells him who he is. God's response to us when we see ourselves as far away from him, and therefore we have a lesser value of ourselves because of our distance from God. God says in that situation, I will reveal myself to you. So what does he do in verse 14? He says, I am who I am. When people ask you what my name is and who I am, you tell them, I am has sent me to you. He says, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. I have sent you to them. Here's the interesting thing about this passage. God is willing to reveal himself to them. So whenever you want to make the excuse, I don't know enough about God to do what God has called me to do. I'm so far away from him. I don't have that deep and intimate relationship that I see in other people. Here's God's response to you. I will reveal myself to you. The third excuse we tend to use is that no one will believe me. We try to act as if disbelief that we find in people, it really doesn't bother us. We try to have this hard, shell, and we try to say, we'll work and we'll serve even if we don't get the accolades and even if people don't pay attention. But if we're being very honest, the truth is when people are not bought into what it is we're called to do, it affects us negatively. It may not stop us from doing the things that God has called us to do, but it absolutely affects the way we go about doing what we do. And Moses is honest about this. You see, this is an excuse that often hinders individuals from actually living in their purpose. So Moses says in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, what if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? This is a legitimate excuse. This is a legitimate concern. But I love what God says in response. And essentially what he says is, I will empower you to validate you. You see, when God has called you to do something, you don't have to worry about what people will say, because when God has really called you, he will give you the power that will later validate you. What does God say to him? He says in verse 2 and following, he says, look, what's that in your hand? He says, it's a rod. Well, he tells him in verse 3, throw it down on the ground. And he says, as he threw it on the ground, the staff, the rod, it became a snake. Moses jumps back. The Lord tells him in verse 4, pick that rod up. And as he reached out to grab its tail, it shows us that when he grabbed it, it turned back into the rod that it was before. You see, these are the sort of things that we find in God's word that helps us to see that God won't leave us out there. So there's no need to say, like I once said, oh, no one will believe me. I don't have the abilities that other people have. I can't do things the way other people do them. Well, that's okay, because in your own way, God will empower you for the assignment. He's going to allow you and help you to have all the power you need to fulfill the assignment that he has called you to do. And I want you to see this. He will do it in a way that fits who you are and in a way that only you can do it. You don't have to search for ways to do this. You don't have to clone yourself or be a clone of someone else, or rather, should I say. God has power reserved for you that will later validate you. Now, one of the other excuses that Moses used was, I don't have what it takes. He said in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10, he says, Lord, I'm not very good with words. For some of us, that's our excuse. I can't talk very well. For some of us, the excuse is, Lord, I don't have, the smarts. I don't have the money. I don't have the connections. I'm not given many opportunities. All these things we come up with is essentially a way of saying, Lord, I just don't have what it takes. Well, when God hears us say, I don't have what it takes, his response to us is, that's okay, because I have what it takes. You see, the truth is, if people are incredibly honest, none of us have what it takes. So whenever God heard Moses say, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled, God's response was, that's okay, because I have what it takes. And he says in verse 11, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether a person can speak or do not speak, who will hear or do not hear, or who sees and who will not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now he says in verse 12, now go, I will be with you. Here he reminds him again, I will be with you. That's the key to it all. I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. Because God is with us, we don't have to worry about what our deficiencies are, because it's okay. It's never a deficiency if God is with us. Our deficiencies are only a problem if God is not with us. You see how that works? So the last excuse is one that is also very typical. And the excuse that he says is, Lord, there's somebody else that can do it better than I can. We've all made that excuse because we all tend to look at other people and we want to be what we idolize or what we imagine is a status or a symbol of greatness. So when God hears this excuse from Moses, here's what he says in response to him. He says, I will send you help, but I will not send your replacement. You see, here's the thing that we have to learn. God will never send replacements whenever he's called us to do things that only we can do. God will send us help, but God will never send a replacement when he has called us to do something that only we can do. And let me say this to you. There are some things that only you can do. It's the thing that only you can do and no one else in the world can do it. I often think about figures like Billy Graham and Michael Jordan and LeBron James and Derek Jeter and Martin Luther King and all these heroic figures, Mother Teresa, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You think about these kinds of guys and ladies and the impact that they've had on the world. And the question that comes to mind, and at least in my mind, is if they were able to do that, why can't everyone have that kind of impact in the world? Why can't everyone be just as impactful in their purpose as Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and some of the other heroic figures that we have seen in history? And I am convinced that the only distinction, the only difference between a Martin Luther King and the person who doesn't maximize on their potential is the fact that Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, these individuals did everything they could to be the best version of themselves. In other words, they didn't try to be someone else. They understood that they had the ability to be exactly who they are, and they were the best version of themselves as they could possibly be. And this is what God is saying to Moses. Listen, I didn't call anyone else. If I wanted someone else, I would have called them, but I didn't call them because they are not qualified for the position and the thing that I am calling you to do. But God understood the excuse. God understood the hindrance and the stumbling block and the weakness of Moses. And what God said to him is, I'm going to send you help, but he will not be your replacement. He says in verse 14, he gets angry with Moses. He says, all right, he said, what about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks well. And look, he's on the way to meet you now and will be delighted to see you. He says, talk to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak, and I will instruct you both in what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say. You see, Moses could not get out of what God was calling him to do here. Even when he said, Lord, choose somebody else, God said, all right, I'll choose somebody to walk with you, but you still going to have to take the walk. And I want us to understand today, we're facing some of the same responsibilities. You see, you may not lead a whole nation out of bondage, but God is calling you to do something, and you have not done it yet because deep down you're not convinced that you have exactly what it takes to actually do it. And if you thought you had what it takes, rather, you would actually be doing it. I want to awaken that gift in you and stir up that gift in you to understand that because God is with you and because he's established in you a purpose to bring other people to the worship of him, you have exactly what it takes to do exactly what God has called you to do, because he is the power that you need. And that power is residing with you and in you. All right. So let's get busy. Let's do what it is that God has called us to do. Let's not shy away from it. Let's not act like, it's not important. Let's get it done. Let's do it because God has work for us all to do. Listen, thank you all for hanging out with me. This is day one. Please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Please. This is going to help the algorithm. We're going to try to break the YouTube algorithm and put Christian content creators in this space to share the news about Jesus Christ, who has called us to call other people to worship him together. All right. Until next time, we'll see you tomorrow in day two. Take care. God bless.